Okay. Before we begin the artist discussion, I should probably also just explain what's going on in the background here. We're just going to be showing a series of slides. We have no control over the slides. They'll just be running in a loop. They'll be showing part of the film here. There's also an installation shot from the first time the work was shown, which was at an art space in Hanoi. And you can see this beautiful sort of pagoda-like installation. We'll obviously also have installation examples from the work upstairs, Zugzwang, as well as in cold print from Nottingham Contemporary. And finally, we will also have a couple of pictures of the actual exhibition catalogue, which is really going to be framing the entire discussion today. So we'll just keep that going on in a loop. So Sung, welcome back to Munich again. First and foremost, it just occurred to me when I was watching that, I've never asked you about the title of the work. No Gods, No Masters.
Yeah. No Gods, No Masters is actually sort of an anarchist slogan. Maybe advocating for thinking for yourself in a way. So I used this title for this video work.
And as I mentioned at the beginning as well, the work was filmed in Mo Tsai in the south of Vietnam, but also in the so-called Black Virgin Mountain in the west of the country, as well as in Hai Duong in the north, which is where you were born. What links these three locations in relation to the work in particular?
So the work initially started off with my research into ghost tape number 10, which was, as you mentioned, a psychological operation of the US Army. Can you hear me well? Is this maybe better this way? Okay. And essentially, ghost tape number 10 was made to combat the Viet Cong in the South, and inherently within that conversation there is already this dialogue between North and South Vietnam. And my investigation for the video work was sort of about linking these two quite disparate histories. One that took place, in 1969 and beyond, during the Vietnam War, and this very specific psychological warfare operation. And the other is sort of like a more contemporary use of Vietnamese spirituality within my own home. So the video work sort of navigates and shifts between these two desperate sides. Because Vietnam and its spiritual practices are so present within the country, and they really influence the way we value and believe in certain ideas. And for me it was quite interesting how actually also my family sort of tries to manipulate me. For example, in the video footage that you saw, it's a ceremony that my family puts up every time I return to Vietnam. And it's a quite elaborate ceremony that takes several hours, where my auntie, who is pixelated within the footage, becomes she becomes a medium. In this case, she is my dead grandmother, and I can sort of talk to my grandmother through her body. And you can also see within the footage that there are these wallets, and the paper is sort of like this gold leaf paper that they're sort of trying to bless. So they are actually blessing a wallet. So it's actually a lot about, fortune, economic and financial stability, and that's sort of the things that they wish for me. And within the Vietnamese-American War, ghost number 10 was used in a totally different way. So the Americans hired a Vietnamese voice actor, which was a man, but then also a woman and a child, to sort of play this Viet Cong soldier that is dead, and that Viet Cong soldier sort of talks to his comrades and tells them, my friends, if you are still alive, I died a senseless death in war, just go home, like give up the war, leave. And so there are just like different ways how spirituality is sort of being deployed within past and contemporary Vietnam that I was very interested in within this video work.
And speaking about the Vietnamese-American War, We often hear about how this was the first so-called televised war, that is bringing images of a conflict into the homes of people all over the world. However, the sounds associated with the war are often underplayed or diluted, and what I mean by that is that from the standpoint of Euro-America, the sounds of the Vietnamese-American War commonly bring to mind film. I'm thinking of Platoon, Good Morning Vietnam, Apocalypse Now, which render the experience through this prism of American popular culture. And so when people think of the sort of the sounds of the Vietnam War, it brings to mind Barber's Adagio for strings, Wagner's Flight of the Valkyrie, the Rolling Stones' Painted Black, and so on and so forth. And what I really like about this work, however, is that it confronts and contradicts this. It demonstrates the sort of the instrumentalization of sound as a mode of psychological warfare, both during and after the conflict. And so with just thinking about this, I was wondering if you could maybe speak to the interplay of the various sounds within the work, so both those that were recorded live out in the field, as well as those that you took from the archive, and the manner in which this actually drives the narrative of the work.
Yeah, I think what you mentioned about sort of the Vietnamese-American War being the first televised war on TV, I think equally the sound and the way the sound is deployed via the movies and so forth actually tells more about the American psyche than it does about the Vietnamese one, because obviously the perspective is extremely American. And for me, this video work was also about maybe countering that engagement with that history, but from a sort of more local perspective. So I went to Mor Gai and Nui Ba Dan, where the ghost tape was once broadcasted to the landscape, and recorded it as it was in 2017. And the sound I deployed are essentially field recordings from the place now. But I was sort of, in search for a ghost while I was there, like at least like trying to look for the remains of whatever occurred on that land. And so the sound is like a very strange, warped perception of that ghost, or sort of my interpretation of that ghost. And I find the Vietnamese landscape overall extremely haunting. Just if you think about the approximately 3 million landmines that are still under the ground and buried, but they could go off, or the Vietnamese sort of like also the dead bodies that are kind of part of the landscape there, to the ghost tape that was like put on top of that landscape as well. So the sounds within the video work kind of try and capture that somehow. That happens electronically manipulated, like through sounds that I electronically manipulated, but also through relays, or almost like delayed sounds. So, for example, there's this kind of absurd moment when the dogs come in and the barking is delayed, and it's sort of like almost like a memory of that barking than it is the barking itself. So I tried to just deploy sound in ways that I could think and remember history and the contemporary within the work.
I actually like the idea of ghosts and traces and sort of memories of sound and things, because this really gets to the point of why I thought this would be such an interesting film to show tonight in relation to the exhibition both here and in Nottingham. And it also got us thinking a lot when we were discussing the exhibition here in Munich, particularly in relation to the way in which sound in particular is experienced in different ways. So for example, I first encountered the work No Gods, No Masters on a tiny little television screen as part of a group exhibition in Amsterdam with a set of incredibly bad headphones. But the work, as you will see behind me at some point, was originally exhibited as part of this much larger installation in Hanoi, alongside newspapers and a custom-built environment. And it will actually be shown next month as part of the group exhibition Magical Soup at the Hamburger Bahnhof in Berlin. Furthermore, we've just seen the work here, both here in Munich and online as sort of a film. And so we have an incredible range of ways in which to think about the modes of reception and how that might alter someone's reading of this particular work, especially in regards to the interplay of sound and images. I'd just like you to comment on the different ways in which this work can be and has been engaged with, contingent upon where and how it's been shown.
Yeah, so initially I conceived the work for my first solo exhibition in Vietnam, in Hanoi, and there, I hope the images come up soon, but there the video work was actually enclosed within sort of like a metal structure, and the sort of ornamentation is actually taken from sort of temples, but you have these ornamentations also between like private and public housing, just as, you know, gates in front of a building. And within that exhibition in Hanoi, which was titled Remote Viewing, I actually tried to create two sensory experiences within one space. So you sort of had the metal structure within which you could see the video work, and I guess within it there was a more sensorial engagement, perhaps, you know, hopefully triggering something more in your subconscious. Whereas when you walked outside of the structure, you would encounter these newspaper articles that I wrote with an American journalist in relation to Ghost Tape number 10 and the archival research that I did. And there, the engagement was much more cerebral. You know, it was much more about information, evidence, reportage, and providing the viewer with just the background story about the ghost tape. And the video was sort of without sound, and the sound was actually displaced on two plinths, and it was shown as a 4-channel sound installation because that's how it was originally conceived. And you would engage with the sound on the one hand while you were looking at the footage, and then on the other hand you could listen to the sound also while you read these newspaper articles. And the sound in these two moments had just kind of different purposes. One to sort of, you know, emotionally, exactly, so this is how it was within the structure. And you engage with the sound more emotionally while you were in the structure, and on the outside it was almost as a way of proof making, of showing that this ghost tape happened, and that you can literally listen to it while you were in the space. And yeah, so sound in these two moments already were really interesting to me as a manipulative tool, as psyops, you know, conceived it as a psychological warfare weaponry, and on the other hand, through the way I tried to report about Ghost Tape number 10, also to sort of, deconstruct that and dismantle it, and to make you understand how it was created and built in order to manipulate and be effective.
I mean, it's interesting, we're sort of talking about the sort of difference, I suppose, between a soundtrack, which is something that we assume, and sound that can be accessed almost anywhere and at any time, and a sound installation that in many ways grounds a work within a very specific time and place, in that it acts as a stimuli, it triggers a certain memory response in the viewer. And indeed, within all of your work that incorporates sound, there's almost always a very specific consideration about place. So, for example, during the curatorial discussion that led up to the exhibition here at Haus der Kunst, we talked about your choice to include the overture to Wagner's Tannhäuser, for example, and its connection to the history of Germany and to Bavaria. And you've just spoken, obviously, about this very sort of strong connection of the work in relation to Hanoi, where obviously it brings up the relationship between North and South Vietnam, which is ongoing. But what about when the work is actually taken out? When you take a sound installation and you place it within the context of, say, streaming online as part of a film screening that we're doing now, how do you think that alters the idea of the sound installation, or does it actually turn it into a soundtrack?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I really perceive myself as an exhibition maker. Anything else is sort of a compromise to me. I'm not quite sure what I think about these online platforms and how the work changes, and I'm not sure I like that. So for me, it's very much about being in the space with the work and engaging with it from that point of view. But of course, that's an extreme privilege to be able to, especially within a pandemic, to be at the museum, at the moment. So I think it maybe just needs a bit more explanation, and hopefully something like this conversation also helps the viewer to understand the work and to engage with the work beyond the experience of video and single channel sound. But I'm not sure it's the best solution. I don't know.
I think it's very interesting about talking about you being in the space and sort of you responding to a particular space, because of course your experience of the Vietnamese American War and its aftermath is also characterized by a sort of sense of being one step removed from it, despite the profound impact it has had on your life, obviously. So with this in mind, how does the concept of distance, or being on the outside and looking in, and yet being somehow intimately connected to a subject, play out in both your research process and in a work such as this?
I often think about what actually motivates me to make a work, and a lot of times that is linked to place. So obviously Hanoi, Vietnam, and also the show here at Haus der Kunst in Germany, where I grew up, very specifically responds to these places and how they have played out within my own biography. I think the show here at Haus der Kunst, Zugzwang, obviously deals with my experience with the bureaucratic state of Germany. And it does that through sort of maybe what I call an bureaucratic labyrinth. It's sort of complicating the situation, and the more you get in it, the more you kind of find the awkwardness and weirdness of these bureaucratic documents and the strategic game of the chessboard, and how to navigate through it. And I enjoy making work in relation to a sort of site-specific encounter. And when I did the show in Hanoi, my first intention was always to make it from the perspective of the outsider. So I actually collaborated with an American journalist on writing these newspaper articles, because I am sort of a diaspora returning back to Vietnam. And I wanted to make that quite clear while I was there, that it's not so much a Vietnamese, quote-unquote, artist going to Vietnam, making a work about Vietnam, but actually I'm sort of an outsider coming back and looking at that history and my own history within my family, but through the means of reportage, through journalism, because that's actually also how I encountered the Vietnamese American War from abroad. So these things play a huge role. I think within Zugzwang, that interplay happens similarly. I'm sort of taking on the role of a German bureaucrat, maybe, and I try and dissect the bureaucratic system from within, and I don't really reveal a lot of information about myself, but more about how these forms dictate what I perhaps could be. So,
As I'm sure it's becoming clear, although we advertised this work tonight as a film screening, I really see the works like No Gods, No Masters as a sound work, first and foremost, a sound work supported by visual material, both in terms of it being about sound, that is the ghost tapes, as well as using sound as a means of sculpting and delineating space. And indeed, this could be said to sort of encompass most of your recent works, including exhibitions in London, Berlin, and of course in Nottingham and here. So during our discussions about Zugzwang and of course talking about the publication, the sculptural properties of sound played an absolutely vital role. And it's for this reason, for example, that within the publication we decided to incorporate a QR code which allows people to listen to the soundtrack as they're actually looking at the book. However, before we talk about the specifics about the exhibition upstairs, and with a thought to people who are either viewing it online or people who are going to view this conversation after the exhibition closes, I thought we could take a moment to describe the manner in which the sound sculpts the space upstairs. So, how do visitors experience the work, in your opinion, as they move through the installation?
So, essentially it's a 6-channel sound installation made up of 3 channels of sort of like Wagnerian instruments that I made, based on Wagner's Overture to Tannhäuser. And then there are 3 channels that are more specifically office noise, that create rhythms through, the change of speed and the repetition. And depending on when you come into the space while the sound work is playing, you encounter them in the various objects within the shelving units and on the desk. And I perceive it almost like an opera with still objects. So you suddenly hear, the trash can making noise, or you hear the rhythmic sounds coming out of the computer. You have sort of first aid kit where you hear steps of a person going through, and so for me it's sort of like perhaps a surprise moment when you come into the space, because the sound is not visible in the sense that you can see the mechanics of it. So there's no cabling, or there's no speakers, and I think it's, my documentation images are extremely confusing because, it's a sound installation that is sculpted through these objects and installations. But I personally perceive it as a sound installation that is assisted by sculpture. So, I think that just poses a lot of difficulties in regards to making a book, having installation shots online, because they can never actually convey what I intended to do within the sound installation within a space, and how you can experience the sound, because obviously when you're closer to an object you hear it much more strongly next to you than when you're on the opposite side of the space and sound is coming from the opposite corner. But I kind of like the confusion in a way. It's very much part of my work that people probably misunderstand it. And that actually started off with the ghost tapes. So my interest in sound really got sparked by ghost tape number 10, and how, psychological manipulations can happen through sound. And one of the earliest images that I encountered when I was researching ghost tape number 10 was an American soldier standing, in a forest in Vietnam, carrying a backpack with 6 speakers. And the sound source was strangely concealed, or it was very fuzzy. You couldn't really see the speakers. And I made a work in relation to that in London. The show was called Song for Unattended Items, where the speakers were literally hidden within bags and backpacks, and so I think concealing the source was from the very beginning a big part of it. I mean, also ghost tape number 10, mostly they play it at night where you can't really see where it's coming from. So, yeah, I think my sound installations have this kind of like, unnerving quality to it. Just by hiding the source of the speakers, it's very odd, but in a weird way, you don't quite know where the sound is coming from, and yeah, perhaps that's a good thing.
I know. I mean, we were talking earlier today about the visual representation of sound normally, which, you know, as we said, is quite drab. You know, one thinks always of sort of an image in a publication of some speakers hanging in a space, and that's sort of it. Which is not something you do, because you know, you trained originally as a sculptor, and so you know you think sort of sculpturally. And there is obviously a difference between the sort of the sound that you get when you scan in the QR code here, which is a single channel work, and the 6 channels that you have upstairs. But within all of the different manifestations of your work, and all, you know, both online and experiencing in the space, you can't really call any of your sound sculptures unassuming. Disorientating is a better descriptor. Which certainly, in the terms of Zugzwang here, feeds into the rest of the experience of the rest of the spaces. You have these oversized shelving units. You have these mirrored surfaces that warp the picture, the reflection of the viewer as you walk through. And yet, it's not bombastic. And this is what I think covers almost all of your works. It's not uncanny in the sense of something like a Gregor Schneider, which, you know, sort of beats you over the head with it. It's much more unnerving. It has a habit of subtly evoking unease in the viewer, and sort of stays with you as a sort of trace, as a sort of ghost after the experience of the exhibition. And I know this is something you think through in your work. So, I mean, how does this play out during the process of recording and editing the soundtracks, such as Zugzwang in Munich? In other words, how does it play in terms of your thinking of taking a piece of music by Wagner, then filtering it through these office sounds, and then sort of filtering it back through Wagner?
So what I was trying to do within Zugzwang was sort of like embed these office sounds on the one hand within the installation, but also trying to filter Wagner through it. So we actually made instruments out of these noises. So we scored them in accordance to Wagner's composition, and then we filtered it back into the track. So what you have is sort of like a weird mix of very ordinary office sounds that you hear in every office, like a printer running, or like the ticking of a mouse, or but then there's also like a strange rhythmic production that happens through the noise. And yeah, they are sort of like being put back into this sort of like strange environment that I created for them. But yeah, I think when I started making sound installation, I was really interested in sort of challenging the medium within it. So because I come from sculpture, like I studied with Andreas Luminski in Hamburg, I was sort of interested in how these sounds could be housed within an environment, and how sort of the housing of the sound can change the perception of how we perceive it. So yeah, the sound sort of just accompanies you throughout the space, almost, yeah, quietly, but at the same time purposefully. But it hopefully still allows you to engage with the works individually. I think that's important to me.
As I mentioned at the very beginning, we've endeavoured to mediate this project via several mediums. We've made films, we've had discussions, we've created events on social media, and of course we've created this publication. And yet, right from the very outset, we've encountered the question of how to record the experience of both exhibitions, both the exhibition here in Munich and the one in Nottingham, in a form that is in no way given to media such as sound. So you've spoken about the experience of the space. I'd like you to take a moment to speak about the experience of the publication, both in terms of the exhibition here and in Nottingham. And so as an example, we're talking about this sort of sense of disorientation that is evident in both exhibitions, and this is sort of fed into the decision, for example, to emboss this cover with the sort of the design from the mirrors upstairs. It also feeds into the decision to use the silver ink on the pages, so that when you look at the images under light, something seems just a bit off. Could you talk just a bit to how sort of the idea of actually creating the catalogue, not as just a recording of the exhibition, but actually as an object of itself, as an extension of the exhibition, played into your thinking?
So we replaced the black ink for actually 50% silver, so 50% black ink, but it's very silver. And so the ink is almost also like a bridge between the two exhibitions in a way. And we wanted to move away from using the installation shots as something precious, but instead, almost include the disorientation within it. Because for me, my installation shots are anyway not really representing what the exhibitions are. Like, to me, they don't really do that, or they are not really capable of doing that, because, the sound element is the main part, sort of the show. And so I didn't feel the need to treat them that preciously. But instead, we just used the silver ink to sort of, have it completely run through the exhibition as like almost like a uniting force to show both exhibitions.
To transpose...
And the text as well,
Yeah, to transpose that sort of slight sense of disorientation to the experience of going through the catalogue, whereby it's not overt, it doesn't sort of glare in your face, but at the same time, if you're listening to the soundtrack through the QR code, and you're going through the sort of the images, something seems just a little bit out of joint, and that sort of feeds back into the book itself.
Yeah.
I think at this moment we should open up the floor to some questions. You can make them hard as well, because I've obviously thrown a few doozies. We have one here.
Hi, thank you so much. I've seen Zugzwang, I saw it on the opening night, and I thought that No Gods, No Masters was extremely interesting, and I think both of your works as a white person sitting in Munich from a European background, and as part of the EU, you hear my Scottish accent for at least another 4 months. These bureaucratic systems are still kind of unsettling, and even historically speaking, with No Gods, No Masters, these images are viscerally attacking in a sense, and I wondered, that's my experience as someone disconnected, and you talked about your own disconnection. I wondered how this work, especially No Gods, No Masters, was received in Hanoi by people who probably did experience or had memories, vague even if at all, of this experience, and if there was at all kind of correspondence for you or realization for you in the work.
Yeah, what is so interesting about Vietnam, because the censorship in Vietnam is so extreme that many people didn't even know about this operation. So, obviously also I did the exhibition in 2017 when there's barely any witnesses left, or at least I didn't meet any in Hanoi. So the reception was sort of like quite new to them as well, because you also have to imagine, Ghosted Number 10 is such a small part of the Vietnamese-American War. It's such a tiny part of history that I tapped into and, enlarged and looked at and investigated. But it was actually even surprising for my Vietnamese peers to engage with it more. And I went to the sites, so I actually did interviews with people on site in Mo Gai. So I interviewed like a coconut farmer there, and I asked them about the war. I asked them about Ghosted Number 10, and it was kind of sad and shocking, but people feel really uncomfortable talking about it because the censorship issues are so extreme. So they mention it a little bit, but then they veer off just because they fear, the government, or they would fear that I would do something with the material, so the government would know. And what was, it got so extreme that when I did the exhibition in Vietnam, the English texts were exactly what I wanted them to be, the writing in English, was exactly left how I wanted it. But we also translated all the text into Vietnamese, for the audience to read. And we literally practiced self-censorship in order to show the work. And that was actually a huge conflict for me, because, my sort of Western view was just, I would be like, no, we cannot do that. This is so strange. I can't identify my own work in this anymore. You literally had to erase the term war. You had to erase Ghostim number 10. So there was almost nothing left of the initial work that I wanted to talk about. But at the same time, it had to be done because, there's a whole, I come there and I show with a non-profit institution that is 20 years old. It's the oldest one in Vietnam. And I want them to be able to continue making exhibitions. And, I can't just take on the position of, this is what I want. So, we self-censored, and there was a governmental person at my artist talk, so you couldn't actually talk freely at my own artist talk. And it's an extremely uncomfortable situation where you're kind of talking about something but not really talking about anything. And I think until today I'm not quite sure what I think and how I relate to that experience. I don't really know. So the conversations that happen actually around the war happen between closed doors in private, but they can't happen in public, not even in a small project space. That's, unfortunately, the reality at the moment.
Hi. I was wondering about the depictions of the chess positions on the forums. It was in many of the forums like the Alekai defense.
Mm-hmm.
So is it because you played this, or is it because of Alekai's past of Bruce Blanc, White Emigré, or?
No, actually it was because I was really interested in, maybe you know this chess player called Torre Repetto. He's a Mexican chess player, and this game is from 1926 between Feria, who's not a very good player, and Torre Repetto. And he used Alekin's defense as the opening for the game, and that's why the work is titled that way. But I was interested in Torre Repetto because he just has a quite interesting biography. He was a professional, grandmaster player, but had a very short career, and I think a year or two. It was very short, the period he played professionally, and then he got sent to a mental institution because he kind of, went mad, and you don't know why, whether it had to do with his chess. Or? Oh yeah. Yes, and so I was sort of more interested in him, and I chose the game because of him. But I had to choose the game with Freire because it had 30 15 moves each, because that was the number of my documents. So I sort of had to fit the game within the documents I wanted to show, because it was really about beginning the game until Freire gave up. So that's why that's this game.
I should just put in context for the people online, they were talking about the chess game played up in the exhibition upstairs.
Oh yeah?
There was a question right up the back there.
It's exactly the same question.
Oh yeah? Are you chess enthusiasts?
I found it so interesting to follow the chess game, and I wanted to ask you whether you felt that this was an analogy to the process of application for citizenship.
Yeah, so Freire is actually the white position, and Torre Repetto the black, and Torre Repetto wins. I mean, he's the better player, very obviously within this game. And for me, there is just within the bureaucratic process, you are sort of the government obviously has the upper hand, right? The government essentially in the end decides over whether your application is being approved or dismissed or what is happening to it. But the more sort of intelligent you play the game, the more likely it is for you to get something approved. So the questions that are being asked within these, for example, asylum application form or the citizenship application form are made, or they are designed in a certain way for you to respond to them, because you can't always completely say the truth, perhaps, or at least you have to modify it in a way that it fits within the spacing and within the category of being assigned as a refugee, for instance. So I was sort of interested in that interplay between the bureaucrat and the citizen, and how you're being put in a role to perhaps strategically navigate the situation.
Okay. And I suppose just while I'm looking, again, just for people who may be watching or seeing after the event, Zugzwang, the title. Can you explain it?
Zugzwang is just a situation in chess when you are in a disadvantaged position as a player and you are forced to make a move ahead. And, any move that you make is sort of a disadvantage for you.
And it's a wonderful inversion of the usual idea of German taking on English words, where this is an example of a German word that has obviously been taken up in a very specialised field within English, and also for anyone who is actually an English native speaker, Zugzwang is a real tongue twister as well. I'm going to take this. Oh no, there's one more question just over there.
Yeah, depending on which exhibition, the texts sort of take on kind of a different purpose. So for Ghost Step number 10, or No Gods, No Masters, the installation remote viewing is actually it's literally a newspaper reportage. So I actually used the medium of text in order to report back about Ghost Step number 10. I sort of imagined, so one newspaper article called Troops Employ Fantastic New Tools in Nam was fictionally placed in 1969. So I sort of imagined what it would have been like if there was a newspaper article that would report about this operation. How that also would have perhaps changed history or altered history if people would knew that that happened. And within these first newspaper articles, I was quite interested in thinking about the journalist, or the position of the journalist, of how they convey information, which to me is actually never completely neutral, because each newspaper, as we know, obviously always portrays from a certain point of political view. And later on, within the exhibition here at Haus der Kunst, it takes on a much more fictionalized encounter. So I tried something new actually within Zugzwang, where I interweave, I invent a person. So James Stevens is an invented person, Mr. Stevens, and he is pictured as like a A+ bureaucrat within the EU, and I try and actually interweave real information. So all the newspaper articles are based on true facts or true research. It's not so much about inventing false information or something like that. It's much more about the interweaving of things, maybe a fictional character, but then with information that is really based on my research. And within Haus der Kunst, the newspapers navigate you through a quite complex situation. I talk about Eurodac, the invention of border technologies to prevent immigration to Europe, but I also talk about the confusing moment where an expat, who is not perceived actually as a refugee, is caught up in a citizenship application issue where the child can't be assigned a citizenship because they are so cosmopolitan. So it really tries to look at the bureaucratic process from all kinds of angles and portray actually the difficulties and misunderstandings and also the errors that have been done over the years with the new technology that got implemented.
And just quickly to speak about this whole idea of truth and the portrayal of truth within between written forms and things like that, and obviously the use of sound as a weapon. In Nottingham, which we've seen behind us as well, you worked again on this idea of sort of sound as a weapon and the different forms of truth, but you actually turned it on yourself. Just as a sort of closing thing, just because we always talk about what an artist goes through for their work. I think this is a wonderful sort of example of this truth principle being played out. Do you want to just, as a summary, sort of explain exactly what you did to yourself?
Oh yeah. So Nottingham Contemporary is about actually another sound weapon. So one that, in contrast to Ghost Number 10, that the Americans produced, it's a sound weapon the Americans accused Cuba to have produced against them. And that sound weapon is called, it's actually called the Havana Syndrome, and it's called a syndrome because it caused nausea and headaches, physical imbalance to vomiting within US embassy staff that was based in Havana. So it's a very recent occurrence, so it happened end of 2016, and it was coined the Havana Syndrome. And the US government accused the Cuban government of having produced a sound weapon that they can't trace or hear or really understand how it's made, to have caused these illnesses within the US embassy staff. And Canadian embassy staff as well, by the way. And so what I did is I exposed myself to a reconstruction of the sound weapon. So within subcommittees in the US government, they recreated the sound weapon. So they wanted to prove that the sound weapon happened and that it occurred and that it caused extreme pain to their staff members. So they recreated the sound weapon based on witness accounts. So they interviewed and asked, all the embassy staff that had symptoms, how that sound weapon sounded like how, what was it like, how did it sound like? And so they made a recreation, in order to show within these subcommittees, and in order to discuss what they're going to do against the Cuban government. They made a recreation of the sound weapon. So I got hold of that recreation and exposed my own brain and myself to it. So in order also to prove that the sound weapon occurred, the US government made brain scans of the US embassy staff to look for brain concussions, and they apparently tried to prove that there were brain concussions within their embassy staff members. And so I did the same. I exposed myself under the MRI scanner and under the EEG scanner to the sonic attack and recorded my brain under the scanner. So as part of the show at Nottingham Contemporary, you can actually see my brain scans on these sort of mirrors, and it's sort of my brain is engraved on that. And you can also listen to my brain waves. So I took my brain waves while listening to the sound weapon, and we recorded it under the EEG scanner, and we translated these brainwaves back into sound waves. So the sound installation within Nottingham Contemporary actually partly consists of my reaction back to the sound weapon. So you can sort of hear my brain being weaponized and reacting back to the Havana Syndrome, if that makes any sense.
You can also see images of the artist, or the result of the artist subjecting herself to possible torture in the book. Just in closing, a couple of notes. So both Sung Tieu Zugzwang and Monira Al-Qadiri Holy Quarter run until the 30th of August here at Haus der Kunst. In the United Kingdom, in cold print, runs also until the 30th of August. We're selling the publication just out the front as you leave, but just before we sign off, I'd also like to take a moment to thank everyone who made this event come together, particularly at the moment because it is just so difficult to put together an event, and we are unbelievably privileged, as Sung said, to be able to do this. So in particular to Magic, to Franz Bergman, to Lily Christoph Homburg and her team for putting it all online, and to all of the staff of Haus der Kunst that have placed out these chairs and made sure that we can conduct this event in a safe environment. And finally, of course, I'd really like to thank Sung once again for a wonderful collaboration and for taking the time to come down to Munich and to engage in this discussion tonight. So thank you, Sung.
Thank you, Damian.